Over the next 20 minutes, we'll take a journey together on implementing agreements and managing supplier relationships. To coincide with this, please read Chapter 10, the Procurement Game Plan. Once negotiations are completed and both parties are satisfied with the agreed upon terms and conditions, also known as T's and C's, it is time to prepare an agreement. That agreement is known as a contract. Contracts are legally binding agreements. After the execution of a contract, it will be the time for closely working with the supplier to ensure what was promised actually is delivered. In this chapter and through this discussion, you'll learn about supplier performance, monitoring, and measurements, as well as managing the supplier relationships to ensure you have successful outcomes. Once the negotiation is done, a new stream of work begins through documentation and updating of contracts that contain terms and conditions. In short, a document that contains what was agreed to, plus a whole lot more. Within it, for a reasonable sized contract, both the supplier and the manufacturer will have their legal department engaged and review it to ensure potential risks are known, discussed, and negotiated. There will be some terms that do pose a minute risk that you'll end up accepting. The larger the contract, the more legal scrutiny that occurs. Once all terms are adjusted and mutually agreed on, the contract itself is signed. Different organizations will have different requirements on who signs the contract based on how many dollars the contract actually touches. The other post-negotiation review is a reflection process where the negotiator and negotiation team of one company, either the supplier or the manufacturer, separately evaluate what went well and what could be done better for future negotiations. From personal experience several years back, I could share with you we had a negotiation where it was myself and an account manager that reported to me negotiated with a customer. Our purpose with the negotiation was to reduce a program we offered them to purchase our products. I thought going into the negotiation that myself and the individual who reported to me were on the same page. We had discussed and role-played in advance. In the meeting, the account manager on our side for my company started taking the negotiation in a direction that our company would not support. It soon became a very awkward negotiation where I was working to rein in my colleague to align with our corporate objectives. We made it through the negotiation and fortunately accomplished what we needed to. Once we were out of the customer's office though and in more of a private place, we sat down and discussed in a lot more detail what went well and what didn't. And I would tell you from experience, once again, it really drove home the importance of ensuring with 100% certainty that all members of your team are on the same page during the negotiation process. So the next element related to the contract, once you do the reflection within it, from a contract, there's life cycle management. So after everybody signs it and it goes into effect, you still need to do performance management with your supplier throughout the term of the agreement to make sure that you're getting what you believe you should be getting and that the supplier is delivering what they should as well. And you set up business review meetings. You know, it depends on the size of the contract. I've seen it where it is done multiple times a month. I've seen it where it's done quarterly, and I've seen it where it's only revisited on an annual basis, depending on the term of the contract. And finally, the final step when you put out an RFP and you have winners and losers as it relates to actual bidders, you actually would notify the suppliers that did not win the agreement and let them know that it's been awarded to someone else. So if we track back within the negotiation process, several areas have been agreed upon. As was shared earlier, the contract formalizes what was agreed to, and it mitigates risk for both parties. For example, if you negotiate and make an agreement with someone and they leave the company, it's very possible that elements of the agreement will be forgotten if it's not formally documented. Even if the employee doesn't leave, people still tend to forget the minute details. Contracts lock in what was agreed to for a specified period of time, which also eliminates the need to constantly renegotiate as new situations arise. Contracts also include details on how expectations would be handled. Finally, all contracts are reviewed by legal and are legally binding once both parties sign them. As an example, probably 15, 20 years ago, I had experience in an organization that allowed members of the team to make their own agreements on the fly. What this means is that every member of our team had the right to negotiate agreements and be the sole approver of them. They also kept copies of the agreements in their own homes. While this was efficient, it certainly wasn't effective. We had members of the team who wouldn't document anything and others who would sign everything. The result was every contract was based on what that individual salesperson thought was the right thing to do. We ran into situations where two equal-sized customers who were equally important had significant differences in their agreements. It might not come to a head at the time, but when employees switch companies and realize one or the other has an advantage, it actually could become a legal issue depending on the situation. We also had a constant flow of deductions, meaning when customers made their payments, they deducted down what they thought the program was off those payments, and we had no idea that the agreement even existed. Over a period of several years, we transitioned this to require all contracts to be ran through corporate. We engaged with legal on the content and aligned on the commitments that would be made. This resulted in eliminating financial commitments that our company didn't even know existed. It also ensured all contracts were reviewed by legal to mitigate company risk and enabled us to hold our customers responsible for what they had committed to in agreement. Finally, you need to remember that having a contract isn't enough. Ongoing engagement with your customer or supplier is absolutely critical to avoid surprises. I'm familiar with major customers that have monthly discussions on performance. Others are quarterly. I talked about this on an earlier slide, but the time frame will vary within the number of reviews you do with them. The takeaway is you need to continue communicating and discussing performance throughout the entire life of the agreement. If you look at this slide, the bottom line takeaways are: number one, contracts protect both the supplier and the manufacturer. Two, legal needs to be involved with it. And three, throughout the term of the contract, you need to engage with your customer or supplier to ensure performance aligns with agreed upon expectations. So by definition, contract management is a process of systematically and efficiently managing contract creation, execution, and analysis and management for maximized financial and operational performance and to minimize risks. Having a written agreement is not a be-all, end-all. Executed contracts should not stay in drawers to collect dust until they expire. Procurement professionals need to actually pay special attention to managing contracts to ensure what was promised during negotiations actually happens in execution throughout the entire life of the contract. Within a contract, it's important you do what you said you would do. When the contract is in place, it's in place for the entire company, not just the individual who signed it. Thus, everyone in the organization who touches that customer needs to understand what the commitment is. From a supplier perspective, if you commit to purchasing from them, you shouldn't have members of your organization buying that specific ingredient or raw material from another source. When they do it, it's called maverick buying, where you buy from whoever you want to. That is also what causes leakage. You make a commitment, plan on the costs that you negotiated, and someone within your organization works around the process, buys it from someone else, and it costs your company money. One way to mitigate this from happening is to include these stakeholders in the sourcing and implementation process to minimize the chance of this leakage. This slide essentially goes through how a contract's cost savings has transitioned over time. I'm going to fast forward through it all. I'm going to tell you where best-in-class companies are today. In short, procurement identifies and actively seeks out cost savings. They do agreements that lock in those savings, and things are formally recorded through contracts. They execute an agreement to produce those savings, they record the savings, and they formalize what a definition of cost savings is so that there is clarity throughout the organization on what is truly a cost-saving activity. Procurement does everything, has strict standards that they follow for recording. They compare what their estimated savings were versus actual savings are, and throughout the life of the contract, they monitor and check this. Let's talk a moment on supplier performance measurements. What do you measure? Well, there's a saying, what gets measured gets done. To ensure organizations achieve all the anticipated benefits after the contract is finalized, they measure performance. They need to determine which suppliers should they measure performance on. The recommendation is that you focus in on those you have the largest spend with, as well as those that are considered to be strategic partners. The performance measures themselves need to track what's truly important. The recommendation is to have no more than 4 to start. This will become the basis of your ongoing discussions with your customer or supplier. You'll likely focus in on the areas of quality, meaning conformance to specification, delivery, did it arrive when it was supposed to, service, did you receive what you were supposed to receive when you needed it, and cost, were you billed correctly. You then need to determine how you get the data you need to measure in each of these areas. As you continue down the path, you'll involve key stakeholders to ensure the relationship is going as it should throughout the process. Once you have the data and stakeholder buy-in, you'll use it to do business reviews and share what's going well, along with what needs to be improved. As shared earlier, it's important to measure supplier performance. The question becomes is what performance measures should you use? Examples are shown on the slide. Additionally, I'll talk to a few just to get you thinking. When we look at quality, delivery, service, and cost, metrics are going to include things like, number one, did the product you received align with specification? How many orders did you receive and what percent of the orders were 100% aligned with specification? From a delivery perspective, once again, how many orders, what percent were delivered on time? Was there any incidents that resulted in the plant not receiving materials on time? Within it, in that specific scenario, I do need to call out if there ever is a situation where it doesn't arrive on time, you need to immediately notify the supplier and not wait for a performance business review. Then if we move on, and we look at a measure from a cost perspective, were you billed correctly? Were there any hidden costs? If yes, for what? Discuss them, and if you don't agree with them, discuss how to make them end. In addition to developing performance measures for measuring the performance of suppliers, best-in-class procurement departments establish metrics for their own performance. Performing well is the responsibility of buyers and suppliers to be able to have productive and collaborative relationships. For your own performance, areas to look at include appropriate lead time being given for orders, so that if your supplier needs to make the product, they have time to make it to be able to ship it to you, and for you to get it on time. Another area is ensuring that you pay invoices within terms, meaning on time. There's a number of other metrics as well. As shown on the slide, you have clear and concise requirements, ensuring that invoices, as mentioned, are paid in a timely manner, and ensuring that process improvement is ongoing with removal of non-value add aspects of processes. A healthy and collaborative relationship with key suppliers goes far beyond performance metrics. It is essential that you get together and set joint goals, share know-how, and also look at technology innovation that your supplier has to offer that may benefit your company. You also explore best-in-class practices, promote executive-level discussions, and routinely conduct business review meetings. As you view supplier partnerships, there's two extremes and options in between. The extremes are transactional and collaborative. In collaborative relationships, there's a high level of trust and cooperation between the buyer and key supplier when they share financial data, processes, and practices to build healthy and long-lasting relationships. Purchases of low dollar value items, for example, office supplies, where there's a number of competing sources and the focus is on efficiency, buyers are actually in the driver's seat directing and controlling the relationship. Within this, they would be considered more transactional type of relationships. Successful procurement departments have a holistic approach in cultivating supplier relationships that are long-lasting and bring value to both organizations. Procurement professionals of these organizations focus on the four components highlighted on this slide. They work closely with their key suppliers to develop them, monitor their performance, and when possible, they piggyback on each other's existing contracts with other suppliers to be able to leverage their buying power. More importantly, these progressive procurement professionals seek their suppliers' ideas for process improvements, best practices, new technology solutions, and for reducing costs and positively impacting the bottom line. In general, all the purchases made by an organization can be placed into four general buckets. Transactional buys, for example, office and janitorial supplies. Critical buys, for example, computers and what is needed to do the work within an organization. Niche buys, for example, marketing services or legal services. And finally, strategic buys, for example, purchasing the raw ingredients necessary to make a product. Monitoring performance and managing suppliers in each segment requires a varying degree of control, interaction, and cooperation. Working closely with strategic suppliers, building trust, and sharing information and data create value and also generate the best overall results for both organizations. This slide does a nice job of talking about the evolution of a supplier relationship. You know, there's many elements of it. You can talk about early supplier involvement, where when you're going to come out with a new product, you have the supplier involved early in the process to understand, is there value that they could add as far as, what would be an appropriate solution. You look at cost savings opportunities within your supply chain. Is there something you could do differently that would reduce cost? I've seen it happen on the chemical side of things where lines get washed down and you meet with the supplier to talk about, are they using the right amount of chemicals? Is there an opportunity to save there? Suppliers in general are an awesome source of ideas. What you need to remember is they work with companies other than your own. They might have ideas for you on how to improve your production processes of a given product that you never would have thought of on your own. Resolving conflicts within that, it's important that you keep in mind that there's always two sides to a situation. Your view of it is not necessarily always the right one. When the supplier fails, it's important that you take ownership of it through the contract, but that you also hold your supplier accountable. And there's times when your supplier relationship will actually reach the point of no return where you literally need to fire them. Let's visit a moment on reconfiguring and rationalizing the supply base. To begin, a reminder that the supply base is a part of the entire supply network, which is, for the most part, controlled by the buyer. In short, it's who the buyer contracts with and/or purchases product in a category from. Let's begin with reconfiguring. In this situation, the buyer did extensive research on the front side and homework to ensure they had a win-win outcome negotiation. They signed an agreement with the supplier, expected the right things to happen, but unexpected things happened throughout the life of the contract, which negatively impacted their relationship. If the supplier becomes non-responsive and the buyer essentially has to get tough to get what was promised to them, they likely will be reconfiguring their supply base. In short, they'll find a new supplier. Then there's the concept of rationalization. This, in short, is your attempt to have the right suppliers and the right number of suppliers. You essentially review each category and spend and identify current and potential suppliers, and then ensure that you actually have the right suppliers. So within it, there's a number of different suppliers in most category or grouping of products that you buy. So you look at a number of different options. Your first option is to reduce the number of suppliers you buy from. So maybe you have 10 that you're buying from today and you make a determination that you should cut that back to a smaller number. You might also choose to increase the number of suppliers you work with in a category, and through it ensure who you are working with is actually strong in the category that they're awarded. Then there's the concept of maintaining. Your suppliers are good. You don't need to adjust anything. You leave it as is. If you progress on, you could have keep the size, change the mix. So when you look at this, quality and quantity of suppliers matters. So you might wish to have as many suppliers as you have today, but swap some of the suppliers out for others who might do a better job with you. And finally, you might have a situation where all of your suppliers in a category are just literally so-so. They're not spectacular. In that instance, you may wish to take a two-step approach of, first off, adding more suppliers to determine who actually can do what needs to be done best, and then over time, reduce the number of suppliers to keep the good ones and get rid of the bad ones.